Korea, 1950. Under American leadership, the United Nations went to war for the first time. What began as a conflict between rival regimes, North and South, turned into a confrontation between East and West, threatening to escalate into a Third World War. The Allied forces became embroiled in a war unlike any they'd known. Yet for the Americans, it served as a military rehearsal for one they would come to know only too well in Vietnam. This was a war of sharp contrasts, like the harsh Korean terrain itself, ranging from freezing mountains in winter to parched valleys in summer. It started in rapid advances and retreats, and it ended in trench warfare and continuous bombardment, reminiscent of the First World War. The UN forces relied on superior weaponry to limit their losses, pounding the lightly armed communist soldiers who sacrificed thousands attacking in human waves. Experts believed that the sheer volume of UN air power would win the war. The latest jets added their weight to the range of Second World War planes, using rockets, bombs and napalm in support of their ground forces. Yet even the massive American bombing campaign that systematically pulverized northern cities was instrumental only in grinding the war to its final bitter stalemate, devastating the country in the process. It was a war which nobody won, but the losers could be seen everywhere. A sea of refugees constantly set adrift by the changing tide of battle. 3 million Korean civilians are estimated to have died in 3 years of war. Sporadic fighting between the two regimes turned into pitched battle on the 25th of June 1950. Both sides claimed the other attacked first, but within hours the northern forces, spearheaded by their 230 Russian tanks, had broken through into southern territory. The United Nations Security Council identified the North as the aggressor. The absence of the Russian delegate boycotting in support of Communist China's claim to a seat left the Americans a clear field, and a second meeting called for military support for the South. By the 28th of June, the North's T-34 tanks had led them into Seoul itself, having swept through the Ujeongbu Valley with ease. The Southern forces had melted before them, and now their ranks were swollen by local guerrillas. After a week, the North Koreans renewed their drive south. In the following weeks, the South Korean and US forces suffered a string of defeats, falling back to the southeast around the main supply port of Busan. In danger of being driven out of Korea altogether, the UN command built a defensive line along the Naktung River. For 6 weeks, the UN conducted a stubborn defense of the perimeter. Fighting from prepared positions with artillery support and air cover, they acquitted themselves better than they had in the opening weeks. But the North Koreans showed no signs of flagging. They launched repeated attacks across fordable sections of the Naktung. In 2 days of counterattack, they'd driven the North Koreans back across the Naktung. The UN held the perimeter once again. On the 7th of September, they filed on board ship to join an armada already en route from Japan, carrying 10 corps to Incheon. It was to be General MacArthur's masterstroke, a landing 150 miles behind the front line, at the port for Seoul, seizing the capital itself at the heart of the enemy supply line. The chiefs of staff protested that a landing at Incheon was fraught with problems. The approach through a narrow channel was governed by Wolmi-do Island. The port itself had high walls and a 30-foot tidal range that at low tide could leave landing craft stranded on mudflats. MacArthur argued that the obvious difficulties would only add to the surprise. Dismissing all objections, he concluded simply, "We shall land at Incheon and I shall crush them." After 5 days of sustained bombardment, the 260-strong fleet took position off Incheon on the 15th of September. MacArthur had ordered the Marines to lead the first wave, and as they clambered onto the landing craft at dawn, he appeared on the bridge of the flagship to watch them head in for the first objective. Resistance was remarkably light. Within 2 hours, they'd flushed the few defenders from their bunkers and swept the island. The main force waited at sea for an agonizing 9 hours, coming into land on the next high tide, while the Marines kept the defenders pinned down. Again, there was little opposition, and they quickly established a beachhead. MacArthur's gamble had paid off handsomely, at a cost of only 20 dead. 10 Corps' commander had promised MacArthur he would take Seoul by September the 25th, and he pushed his men on at speed. Belatedly, the North Koreans fought back. They still had 20,000 soldiers around Seoul, and they fought all the way back into the city itself. Then from street to street, and finally from a succession of barricades along the main boulevard. Official notice of Seoul's capture went out on the 25th as planned. Though there were 2 more days of hard fighting before the North Koreans were driven from the city, and by then much of it had been reduced to rubble. By the end of September, the surviving North Koreans had fled back across the parallel, or been rounded up as the UN forces cut their retreat. With South Korea nominally under his control, Syngman Rhee seized the initiative. On the 1st of October, he ordered his own troops across the 38th parallel, in pursuit not only of the northern forces, but of his own dream of a reunited Korea. A week later, the UN forces followed them. Hours after they crossed, the UN resolution ordered that all appropriate steps be taken to ensure conditions of stability throughout Korea. MacArthur again split his forces in 2. While the 8th Army drove on due north of Seoul towards Pyongyang, he sent 10 Corps round to effect a landing at Wonsan on the east coast, hoping to repeat the success of Incheon. This time it failed. The front line had already moved north, and 10 Corps followed, driving towards the Chosin Reservoir and the Yalu River, the border with China. On the west coast, the 8th Army took Pyongyang on the 19th of October, the only time the West ever held a communist capital. Syngman Rhee addressed the crowds from the balcony where his opponent had once stood. All Korea now seemed in his grasp. Among the UN forces, thoughts were turning to home. Their work in Korea seemed finished. Some troops were already preparing to leave. But a week after the fall of Pyongyang, everything was to change. The Chinese entered the war. They poured out of the hills, hitting the UN columns in massive human waves. On the battlefield, surprise was total. Yet the UN intelligence services had consistently discounted the obvious danger of Chinese intervention. Mao Zedong's hold on China after the Civil War was barely secure in 1950. American military and political support for his opponent, Chiang Kai-shek, and the nationalist forces on Formosa was a constant threat. The presence of American forces along the Korean-Chinese border could make his position untenable. 200,000 men of the battle-hardened Red Army made their way across the Yalu River into the mountains of North Korea. Traveling light, without radio communications, they hit the UN forces without warning. Yet after 2 days, they disengaged, just as suddenly melting back into the mountains. They left captured prisoners as the only proof of their involvement, and the UN assumed the threat was gone. MacArthur ordered the Air Force to create a wasteland of the entire area between the front line and the Yalu River, not only to destroy supply lines or enemy concentrations, but as a deliberate punitive demonstration of the sheer power the Allies possessed in the air. They attacked every factory, every city and every village with incendiary bombs and napalm. But suddenly they were attacked themselves. The arrival of the first MiG-15 jets in November astounded Western pilots. That the communists had developed a jet, and one that actually outmaneuvered their own F-80 Shooting Stars in the first jet-powered dogfights, was a profound shock. It was not until the arrival of the F-86 Sabre that they were able to redress the balance in MiG Alley, despite being forbidden to pursue the MiGs to their Chinese bases. MacArthur attacked again on the 24th of November, still confident of taking all Korea by Christmas. For 2 days, his forces pushed northwards towards the Yalu River. Then the Chinese came out of the hills again, and this time they weren't going back. The UN had pushed deeper into communist-held territory, and when the Chinese attacked, it was from the flanks and behind, as well as at the head of the columns. The 8th Army in the west was once again taken totally by surprise, and whole sections of the line simply panicked and collapsed. They lost 11,000 men in the first few days. Many were marched off to face the dreadful privations of North Korean and Chinese prison camps. It became known as the Big Bug Out, the worst American military defeat for a century. A whole army disengaged, joining the thousands of refugees jamming the road south. And once it started, it couldn't be stopped. They abandoned Pyongyang in the headlong rush south, leaving it burning in their wake. But for 10 Corps in the eastern mountains, there was nowhere to run. One of the hardest battles of the war was fought by the 20,000 Marines surrounded beside the Chosin Reservoir, where the temperatures fell to -30 below. The advance guard pushing onto the Yalu River had been decimated. The few survivors who had fought their way back to the base of the reservoir were evacuated from the airstrip, wounded or frostbitten or both. The rest were faced with the long fight back to the coast through 6 Chinese divisions, in conditions which made mere survival a struggle. "We're not retreating," said the Marines commander. "We're advancing in a different direction." That advance continued along 20 miles of mountain road. The Chinese continually worked their way in to harry the column. For them too, the road from Chosin caused incredible suffering. Under constant threat from the air, they couldn't even light fires for fear of bringing down a hail of bombs on their position. And frostbite accounted for many of their losses. The scale of the defeat sent shockwaves through America, and extreme measures were being considered at the White House.
If the United Nations
President Truman made it clear that he considered the situation grave enough to warrant a nuclear solution.
If aggression is successful in Korea, we can expect it to spread throughout Asia and Europe and to this hemisphere. We are fighting in Korea for our own national security and survival.
Britain's Prime Minister Attlee flew to America on behalf of the Allies, seeking assurances against the use of nuclear bombs. And the talk of weapons of mass destruction was toned down. The northern forces swept into Seoul at the end of December, and again the 8th Army couldn't hold them. Those that could withdrew, as first Seoul and then Wonju fell to the north once more. South of Wonju, the 8th Army dug in and finally held the line. Whether through their efforts or because the Chinese supply line had reached its limit, the southward drive stopped. Faced with the rising cost in UN lives, President Truman decided that widening the war would be unsustainable politically, and he limited the UN to a defense of the South. But MacArthur did not agree. From his headquarters in Japan, he was publicly critical of the concept of a limited war. He'd already submitted a long list of nuclear targets on both sides of the Korean-Chinese border. And in early April, he called for all-out war on China, using the nationalist armies from Formosa. By the 11th of April, Truman had had enough.
I believe that we must try to limit the war to Korea. A number of events have made it evident that General MacArthur did not agree with that policy. I have therefore considered it essential to relieve General MacArthur so that there would be no doubt or confusion as to the real purpose and aim of our policy.
It created a political storm in America. General MacArthur came home to a hero's welcome after 13 years in the Far East. For many Americans, the victor of the Pacific and mastermind of Incheon could do no wrong. There was strong support for the stance which he outlined once more to a joint session of Congress before taking his final emotional farewell.
I now close my military career and just fade away. An old soldier who tried to do his duty as God gave him the light to see that duty. Goodbye.
Ridgway's meat grinder advance and the defeat of the Chinese offensives left the front line near the 38th parallel, and both sides agreed to negotiate, following a Russian initiative. On the 10th of July 1951, the UN team flew to the ancient Korean capital of Kaesong to begin negotiations with representatives of both the North Korean and Chinese forces. Both sides now needed and wanted a ceasefire. Hopes of peace were high, and at first it seemed tantalizingly close. But there would be frequent breakdowns. The talking and the fighting dragged on at enormous cost in lives for over 2 more years. The exchange of sick and wounded prisoners in March 1953 was the first movement towards a ceasefire. With the UN as a belligerent, a commission of neutral nations was required to oversee the peace process. Finally, on the 27th of July 1953, General William Harrison led the UN delegation into Panmunjom. Without a word or a sign to each other, he and the North Korean general, Nam Il, signed the armistice agreement. There was no South Korean signature on the document, as Syngman Rhee still refused to accept the existence of the dividing line in Korea, which after 3 years and millions of lives had come to rest almost where it started, near the 38th parallel.
The 1953 coup is very relevant to the U.S.-Iran relationship.
So this has been absolutely critical to the Iranian government.
Many people don't realize that Iran was a democracy at one time.
When people are showing pictures of Mossadegh on the streets of Tehran, it's a way of protesting against the current Iranian government.
I took the idea of writing this book from comments I heard from some Iranians. I would say to them, why is it that Iran has never been able to develop a democracy? And they looked at me very quizzically and said, well, we had a democracy here until America came over and crushed it. Iran has actually been on its path toward democracy for more than 100 years.
This is a 150-year-old struggle that the Iranians have been conducting in order to win their own independence, have their own foreign policy.
After World War II, the democratic system that had existed in form but was not being truly respected emerged in full bloom. Mohammad Mossadegh has been largely forgotten by now, but in his time, he was a huge, titanic figure.
Mossadegh is a symbol of Iranian independence. It's a symbol of a moment in time when Iran stood up and told the rest of the world that it could get along by itself, that it wanted to have control over its own resources.
He decided, as the spokesman really for the whole Iranian people, that it wasn't fair anymore for all of Iran's oil to be owned by one British company that paid Iran almost nothing for the privilege. The standard of living that people in England enjoyed all during the 1920s and 30s and 40s was due to Iranian oil. But at the same time, Iranians were living in some of the most miserable conditions of any people in the world. Iranians demanded that they be allowed to control their own oil and that the money they made from oil would be used not to support the living standards of some European country, but to improve the lives of Iranians. With the unanimous vote of both houses of the Iranian parliament, Iran nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. After a while, the British began to realize they had no choice but to try to overthrow Mossadegh and replace him with a regime that was more favorable to England. Prime Minister Winston Churchill sent one of his top secret agents to Washington. Now, what he said was, Mossadegh is leading Iran toward communism. And sure enough, in his meeting, he didn't even mention the oil situation. Now, Mossadegh was an elderly aristocrat who actually despised all socialist and Marxist ideas.
And unfortunately, because of this coup that took place, sponsored by the CIA and the British Secret Service, this nascent democracy was basically crushed, and the Shah was reinstated, and he continued to reign the country with an iron fist.
So Iranians, especially with President Bush talking about democracy promotion, they say, well, look, we had potential for a much more democratic government back in 1953, and you, the Americans, got rid of it.
Here's an example of an operation that seemed successful at first. We overthrew a guy we didn't like, and we placed in power somebody who would do everything we wanted. But when we look back on it now, and we see what has happened to Iran after we intervened and overthrew its democracy, we see all the unpredicted consequences. It doesn't look like much of a success anymore.
On the first day of Ronald Reagan's presidency, the hostages were released based on a negotiated Algiers Accord in which we pledged neither directly nor indirectly to interfere in the internal affairs of Iran. Of course, we have violated that ever since.
Hanoi, August 1945. The man who calls himself Ho Chi Minh, he who enlightens, is greeted by delirious crowds when he arrives with his guerrilla forces after Japan's defeat. Smaller crowds greet the French, returning to their colony. Ho proclaims Vietnam's independence in September 1945. Years before, this same man left his homeland and rented a dress suit and derby hat to petition President Wilson at Versailles in 1919. Ho pleaded for independence for Vietnam. No one listened to him except the French communists. He became a founding member of their party in 1920. But he never lost sight of his main goal, Vietnamese independence. In the summer of 1946, in Napoleon's castle at Fontainebleau, he seeks to obtain from the French full independence for his country. Paris treats the former photo retoucher with full honors, but behind the glittering exteriors lurk the realities of post-war France, a weak government at home and strongly entrenched colonial interests overseas. Until the end, Ho hopes for an agreement. Last-minute talks with French Overseas Minister Marius Moutet fail. November 1946, French guns hit the port of Haiphong. A few days later, Ho's guerrillas in turn attack the French. Ho goes into the jungle. The Indochina War is on, and it is to last 8 blood-filled years. Colonel Paul J. Hallowell, former OSS man, now a Miami lawyer.
When he came up and asked for arms, there were certain questions we usually asked, and one question that I asked him, and I asked him every time, was, who was he going to shoot? And he said he was going to shoot Japanese, which was fine, and we would ask the question, well, what about the French? And to give the devil his due, he would never commit that he would not use the arms against the French at some point. Had he made that commitment, he possibly might have gotten more arms than he did.
When American arms do go to Indochina, it is 1950, after Korea, and they go to the French. Ho and his cabinet must hide from roving bombers in a deep mine shaft. The French know that the enemy hides below them in the jungle, but Ho's fighters have in their favor their mastery of the art of guerrilla warfare, and above all, their fanaticism. In a final attempt to trap the elusive Viet Minh, the French decide to tempt Ho's forces to fight in the open. As bait, they offer the elite of the French troops in Indochina in an isolated valley called Dien Bien Phu. Spurred on by Ho, the Viet Minh forces accept the French challenge. The experts had predicted that no one could drag artillery pieces and tens of thousands of shells through roadless jungles and across swollen rivers. The Viet Minh take the French position after 56 days of continuous assault. As the battle unfolds, Ho sends a message to his troops. The enemy will struggle with all his might. We must therefore double our efforts and be resolved to win total victory. Dien Bien Phu has fallen, and the French now are ready to talk. They agree to a peace conference in Geneva, May 1954. CBS News correspondent Alexander Kendrick was there.
There were two conferences at Geneva. First, the one on Korea, which got nowhere, and then the one on Indochina. Dulles left before the second one even began, and the United States became only an observer and didn't sign the final agreement. Molotov, the Soviet foreign minister, made the Viet Minh accept the 17th parallel as the ceasefire line, even though it meant giving up territory to the south.
The Geneva agreements leave the victorious Ho Chi Minh in control of North Vietnam. The weak, newly independent state of South Vietnam survives with American support. 750,000 North Vietnamese flee to the south. Reunification elections to be held by July 1956 under the terms of the Geneva Accords never materialize. Each side will accuse the other of breaking the accords first. When Ho calls for the liberation of the South, black-garbed militia loyal to Ho will spread guerrilla warfare below the 17th parallel.
50s, the Guatemalans dared to challenge an American business that controlled much of its economy. The United Fruit Company of Boston owned 500,000 acres of land, the railroad, the port, and telecommunications. But most Guatemalan peasants found it difficult to survive. In 1950, Jacobo Arbenz was voted president. He wasn't a communist, but some of his close allies were. A former military man, Arbenz sought to modernize Guatemala's backward society. Washington was alarmed.
What we were faced here with the obvious intervention of a foreign power, because these homegrown parties are not really homegrown. They're being funded or advised by a foreign power, i.e. the Soviet Union.
Я абсолютно убежден в том, что правительство Арбенса,
the Arbenz government, which had been in power from 1950, didn't enjoy any logistical support from the Soviet Union. We didn't even have diplomatic relations. There was no Soviet mission in Guatemala.
President Arbenz started a land reform program, buying up fallow land to distribute to peasants. In compensation, he offered the landowners the values they had themselves declared for taxes. United Fruit was offered just over $1 million for its land. When Arbenz declared nationalization, the company, backed by the United States, claimed $16 million.
Nada menos que John Foster Dulles, que era el secretario.
No less a figure than John Foster Dulles, head of the State Department, was part of the firm of lawyers acting for the United Fruit Company. His brother Alan was the head of the CIA. So it didn't take much of an effort on their part to persuade their president, a military man, Mr. Eisenhower, to give them the green light to overthrow Arbenz's government.
A CIA operation, codenamed PB Success, mobilized disaffected exiles and peasants into action.
What we wanted to do was have a terror campaign to terrify Arbenz particularly, terrify his troops, much as the German Stuka bombers terrified the population of Holland, Belgium, and Poland at the onset of World War II, and just rendered everybody paralyzed.
The UN met in emergency session. Guatemala City was strafed from the air. Rebels invaded from Honduras. The CIA spread panic. Washington denied responsibility.
The information available to the United States thus far strongly suggests that the situation does not involve aggression, but is a revolt of Guatemalans against Guatemalans.
The Soviets were warned.
Stay out of this hemisphere, and don't try to start your plans and your conspiracies over here.
The American PB Success campaign brought the government down and drove Arbenz and his wife into exile. 9,000 of his supporters were arrested. Many were kept in jail without trial for years. Among those who fled was a young Argentine doctor, Ernesto Che Guevara, who went to Mexico and there met Fidel Castro.
I remember my talks with him. He was terribly indignant and embittered by these events, which had interrupted an endeavor which wasn't even radical. It was a relatively simple change, land reform, which was very just and necessary.
When it opened 137 years ago, the Suez Canal was called the modern wonder of the world. A 160-kilometer-long channel cutting through the desert between the Mediterranean and Red Seas. A voyage from Europe to India was shortened from 6 months to less than 6 weeks. For Imperial Britain, the canal became a superhighway for its expanding empire. London now easily linked to its possessions in East Africa, India, the Far East, and its colony in Australia. When Egyptian nationalists rebelled against the foreigners, it was English troops who took the lead in quelling the riots, declaring the country to be an indispensable possession of the British Empire. For nearly 75 years, Egypt tried in vain to evict the British. It's not until July 1956 that one man will finally succeed. Gamal Abdel Nasser. Nasser is a former army colonel who has come to the port city of Alexandria to celebrate the 4th anniversary of a military coup. The popular rebellion toppled the monarchy and then pushed Britain's colonial army out of Egypt. We are not giving in to the colonialists, Nasser tells Egyptians. We are restoring our rights.
ليديروا شركة القناة ويقوموا بعمل شركة القناة الآن دلوقتي يستلموا شركة القناة.
The canal has been taken without a shot being fired.
It was a bombshell, of course, absolute bombshell. We were very happy, to tell you the truth, because it was the right of the Egyptians to do that. You know, the Suez Canal was Egyptian.
It's the most important waterway in the world, the conduit through which Europe receives more than 75% of its oil.
It gave a tremendous sense of shock, because Britain had not yet really genuinely appreciated in the gut the full effects of the Second World War in depriving Britain essentially of the empire.
Nasser denounces Western imperialism in radio broadcasts heard across the Middle East.
وكما قلت لكم منذ قليل ليس عيب أن أكون فقيرا أو أن أعمل على بناء بلدي، ولكن العيب امتصاص الدماء. كانوا يمتصون الدماء، يمتصون حقوقنا ويسلبونها. اليوم
At the Portsmouth Naval Base, Britain prepares for the worst in the Suez Crisis. Part of her mothball fleet, idle since World War II, is hastily made ready for action.
The crisis is heating up. Nasser is receiving massive military aid from the Soviet Union. He believes he is safe from British attack, but he is ignoring an enemy much closer and much more concerned with his growing military power: Israel. By the fall of 1956, Eden's generals report that their invasion force is ready. They want to attack now, before winter sets in. But Eden is still trying to rally support for his war effort. Increasingly, the British public is turning against him. He is about to give up when the arrival of a secret partner suddenly gives him a deadly new set of options. A French Air Force general outlines the scheme.
And he had invented the following scenario, that Israel should attack Egypt. Thereupon, Britain and France, who had forces in the neighborhood, should say, we cannot allow this kind of war because it will interfere with the Suez Canal passage, which is absolutely vital for the whole world's commerce, and therefore we are going to intervene and hold the two countries apart.
He must have been immediately delighted to be apparently off the hook, because here was a scheme worked out with the French and Israelis, and if they all played their part in this play, he seemed to think it would be all right.
For the plan to succeed, the pact must be kept secret. Logan returns to London with the secret agreement and gives Eden a copy of the signed document.
We returned late that night and took the document to him in number 10. And his immediate reaction was, "Oh my God, I never expected anything to be signed."
Eden orders all the British copies destroyed and asks the French to do the same. They refuse. David Ben-Gurion has returned to Israel and put his copy away for safekeeping. On November 29th, Israel sticks to the script outlined in the secret plan and launches a lightning attack across the Sinai Desert. The UN now faces the biggest challenge of its history as it searches for ways to keep the crisis from blowing up into a third world war. On November 5th, Anglo-French paratroops invade the Suez Canal.
The paratroops thought that they could pull it off on the 5th. The British landed Port Said. Port Fouad was captured by the French, but on the British side, there was some resistance.
With British and French troops fighting on Egyptian territory, the crisis could scarcely become more dangerous, but it does. On November 5th, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev steps in. Britain, France, and Israel are warned that Russia will not stand idly by and watch its ally, Egypt, destroyed.
He said to the world that don't be surprised if a consequence of your actions is that nuclear weapons will fall on London and Paris.
The world holds its breath. Could the Soviets be preparing for war with the West?
This was the first time they had ever made a nuclear threat. And he didn't make it because he assumed it would work. He made it because he felt he had no alternative. The world was waiting to hear what he was going to do for his ally.
That moment I did think this is really going to be the Third World War. There was suspicion, that nuclear weapons would be launched on London, and if Eden didn't back down, that was what was going to happen.
Eisenhower launches his U-2 spy planes to look for signs that Soviet troops are mobilizing. Nothing can be found.
Well, the dirty little secret in Moscow was that they didn't have any weapons that could reach London and Paris.
Britain is now begging America for loans to stay afloat. Eisenhower says no. By the time the main British assault force hits the beach, the fighting is over.
The war was in fact over by the time the bulk of British troops landed.
On the 8th of November, the beginning of the world's first UN peacekeeping mission. The humiliation is complete when in the dead of night, British troop ships quietly slip out of Port Said. In England, demonstrators are demanding Eden's resignation. Now in poor health, and with support within his own party disappearing, Eden makes his decision.
Can I just say, thank you very much for all your kindness to me, all of you, during my period of office.
On January 9th, less than 25 days after he accepted a ceasefire, Prime Minister Anthony Eden leaves politics forever. But he will never admit to the secret deal with Israel. And it is not until 1996 that the copy of the secret pact Ben-Gurion took home with him is made public. When Nasser regains control of the canal, he destroys the statue of de Lesseps, a clear message of Egypt's contempt for Western imperialism.
President Eisenhower meets the Washington Press Corps at a time of grave world crisis.
Within a month of Britain's withdrawal from Suez, Eisenhower does what he said he'd never do: commit U.S. troops to the Middle East.
Will not go to war.
In the following years, much of the Arab world accuses America of replacing Britain with its own brand of imperialism.
This is battered Budapest under the brutal Russian boot. Soviet tanks roam the streets amid the ruins they made as communist secret police hunt down heroic freedom fighters. Here for all the world to see is grim evidence of the brutality and savagery with which the red tanks blasted a defenseless people and their city. 2 Budapest cameramen risked execution to make these pictures and smuggle them out of Hungary. 25,000 Hungarians are dead. Budapest is ravaged, but the communist masters cannot crush a proud people. Defiantly they chant, "We shall be free." Refusing to live under Soviet tyranny, refugees stream into Austria. They flee with little more than the clothes on their backs. At journey's end, they can smile again. Border guards beckon the refugees on as they brave the quicksand of an icy quagmire. The Russians have blockaded highways and destroyed bridges in a desperate effort to halt the mass exodus. But in 6 weeks, 120,000 Hungarians slip out of their troubled homeland, fleeing the black night of Soviet terror. At the American Embassy in Vienna, crowds wait in the streets for admission to the United States. President Eisenhower offers asylum to 21,000. By January 1st, all 21,000 refugees will have reached the United States in the biggest air-sea mercy operation in our nation's history. Under the stars and stripes, these Hungarians can work and wait and hope for the day when Hungary will be free.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are bringing to you the most important story of this century: mankind's breakthrough into space. For the first time, mankind has reached for the stars and found them within his grasp.
The Westinghouse Broadcasting Company filmed the first motion pictures of the Russian satellite.
You are about to witness this historic event.
It is. I see it. About in the center of the screen in the lower third. You got on the side. We moved the camera. Camera was moved there. Now we start over again. Now we start over again, and the stars are in the background. This is a photograph of a monitor screen. There's the object. Across the bottom. Across the bottom. About in the middle of the screen now, I would say. That is wonderful, isn't it?
Suddenly, a future in space seemed possible.
And now back tonight and trying for $20,000 are Eddie Hodges, the 10-year-old schoolboy, and his partner, Major John Glenn Jr., the Marine Corps jet pilot. What do you think of the Russian satellite, which is circling the Earth at 18,000 miles per hour?
Well, to say the least, George, they're out of this world, but this is really quite an advancement for not only the Russians, but for international science. I think we'd all agree on that. It's the first time anybody has ever been able to get anything out that far in space and keep it there for any length of time. And this is probably the first step toward space travel or moon travel, something we'll probably run into maybe in Eddie's lifetime here at least.
Eddie, would you like to take a trip to the moon?
No, sir, I like it fine right here.
My friends, tonight I want to talk to you about the situation, dangerous to peace, which has developed in the Formosa Straits in the Far East. My purpose is to give you its basic facts and then my conclusions as to our nation's proper course of action. To begin, if the Chinese Communists have decided to risk a war, it is not because Quemoy itself is so valuable to them. They have been getting along without Quemoy ever since they seized the China mainland 9 years ago. If they have now decided to risk a war, it can only be because they and their Soviet allies have decided to find out whether threatening war is a policy from which they can make big gains. Today, the Chinese Communists announce, repeatedly and officially, that their military operations against Quemoy are preliminary to attack on Formosa. So it is clear that the Formosa Straits Resolution of 1955 applies to the present situation. If the present bombardment and harassment of Quemoy should be converted into a major assault, with which the local defenders could not cope, then we would be compelled to face precisely the situation that Congress visualized in 1955. There will be no retreat in the face of armed aggression, which is part and parcel of a continuing program of using armed forces to conquer new regions. Some misguided persons have said that Quemoy is nothing to become excited about. They said the same about South Korea, about Vietnam, about Lebanon. Now I assure you that no American boy will ever be asked by me to fight just for Quemoy. But those who make up our armed forces, and I believe the American people as a whole, do stand ready to defend the principle that armed force shall not be used for aggressive purposes. We will not, in these talks, be a party to any arrangements which would prejudice rights of our ally, the Republic of China. We know by hard experiences that the Chinese Communist leaders are indeed militant and aggressive. They said that they were entitled to Formosa and the offshore islands, and that if they used armed force to get them, that was purely a civil war, and that the United Nations had no right to concern itself. They claimed also that the attack by the communist North Koreans on South Korea was civil war, and that the United Nations and the United States were aggressors because they helped South Korea. They said the same about their attack on Vietnam. I feel sure that these pretexts will never deceive or control world opinion. The fact is that communist Chinese hostilities in the Formosa Straits do endanger world peace. I do not believe that any rulers, however aggressive they may be, will flout efforts to find a peaceful and honorable solution, whether it be by direct negotiation or through the United Nations. However, the present situation, though serious, is by no means desperate or hopeless. There is not going to be any appeasement. I believe there is not going to be any war. This has not been the first test for us and the free world. Probably it will not be the last. But as we meet each test with courage and unity, we contribute to the safety and the honor of our beloved land and to the cause of a just and lasting peace.
Throws the bulk of its military manpower into the Algerian rebellion, which daily assumes the proportions of total war. Flying columns fan out through the country, which on all sides has become a target for hit-and-run attacks by native guerrillas. And rounding up guerrillas has kept almost 400,000 of France's best troops pinned down. Chief sufferers in the raids have been the outlying farm communities, many of which have been razed by fire and their operators slaughtered. Whole factories have been put to the torch, even as France builds up its military establishment to peak strength. Armed depots now dot the whole Algerian landscape, as French forces are deployed to provide swift striking power in a war of attrition whose end is not in sight.
On March 6, 1957, the Gold Coast became the first black African colony to gain independence from colonial Britain. Renamed Ghana, this newly independent nation would be led by Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. Nkrumah was celebrated as a hero, a visionary who would show Africa the way to independence. And while Ghana led the way, other African nations would soon follow. Between 1958 and 1964, 26 African nations gained their freedom from colonial rule. It was the end of an era. A new generation of African nationalists had come to power. Men like Nkrumah in Ghana, Ahmed Sékou Touré in Guinea, and Patrice Lumumba in what was then the Belgian Congo. For Africa, it was a period of great optimism. Nkrumah's hopes for colonial independence had begun during World War II. United States President Franklin Roosevelt had secured from British Prime Minister Winston Churchill a promise that all nations of the world would be allowed to chart their own political course. It was the beginning of the end for European colonialism. As World War II drew to a close, the United Nations was formed. It would provide a forum where nations could meet to address issues of mutual concern. Among the founding principles of this new organization was a declaration of support for political freedom and independence. The colonial powers of Europe vastly underestimated the power this would have.
When I first joined the UN in 1945, I was astonished at particularly the British Foreign Office. And people would say, well, decolonization is a small matter, you know, it'll 100 years, 150 years, maybe. Well, actually, it took 20.
In 1948, in the Gold Coast's capital, Accra, disgruntled ex-soldiers demonstrated for fair pay for their wartime service. a number were shot and killed by colonial police, sparking riots across the country. One of those imprisoned without trial in the aftermath of the rioting was Kwame Nkrumah. He had just returned from England to be General Secretary of the United Gold Coast Convention Party. Nkrumah's arrest instantly transformed him into a national hero. The Gold Coast was one of the richest colonies in Africa. Diamonds, gold, and cocoa were its main exports. Its early history was dominated by the slave trade. Nkrumah himself came from a small village near the old slaving forts of Elmina. In the 1930s, he managed to make his way to the United States to study. While in the U.S., he was influenced by African-American scholars and black nationalist pioneers. At about the same time as Nkrumah was gaining prominence in the Gold Coast, Ahmed Sékou Touré was emerging as the leader in the French colony of Guinea, also in West Africa.
Ahmed Sékou Touré, c'est Dieu qui l'a donné à la Guinée. Et Ahmed Sékou Touré a commencé la lutte d'indépendance, d'émancipation du peuple d'Afrique, du peuple de Guinée, très tôt. Il a d'abord choisi la section syndicale pour s'élever contre l'injustice coloniale.
A mineral-rich territory of 5 million people, Guinea had been a French possession since 1891. Like the Gold Coast, it had a history of slavery, and it was still being tolerated by the French.
N'oubliez pas que la Guinée, ça c'est quelque chose qu'on ignore généralement. Quand Sékou Touré arrive au pouvoir en 1957, elle a encore un quart de sa population composée d'esclaves.
A fiery union leader, Sékou Touré built a huge personal following by championing the cause of the downtrodden, including women.
Nous, femmes, nous étions des esclaves du colonialisme et nos maris, nos fils et nos époux qui étaient là étaient en même temps les esclaves. Et comme la tradition africaine voudrait que la femme se soumette à l'homme, nous, esclaves déjà, nous étions encore esclaves de l'esclave. C'est vous dire que c'était ardu. Donc, l'arrivée d'un rassembleur de masse comme le président Ahmed Sékou Touré était la bienvenue. Donc, très tôt, elles l'ont suivi, elles ont milité dans les syndicats, elles ont milité au sein du parti.
But just as African nationalists were gaining power, another global conflict was developing that would have a huge influence on their destinies.
The significance of the Cold War to Africa is something that plays out throughout the 1940s and 1950s. There are all sorts of spins on this. One of them is the attempt by colonial powers to maintain the importance of colonialism in terms of world opinion.
On July the 5th, 1962, and after 132 years of French colonial rule, Algeria was declared an independent nation. The joy of its people was hard to contain. For the path to independence had been a bloody 8-year war that had led to the loss of up to 1 million Algerian lives. That war was prolonged by a breakaway group of hardliners known as the Organization of the Secret Army, or the OAS, which brought France itself to the verge of civil war in its attempt to keep Algeria French at all costs.
C'était une vraie menace. C'était une vraie bataille.
The OAS was a major threat. It wasn't a sideshow. This was a war within a war. And indeed, de Gaulle was almost killed several times in direct attacks.
The activities of the OAS against both French and Algerian targets accentuated the intercommunal tensions in Algeria, which boiled over as independence grew near, endangering the future of the European settlers. In the 2 months after independence, Around 1.5 million European settlers abandoned their homes in Algeria following a series of massacres against them.
You mustn't forget that hundreds of thousands of Algerians died in that war. It's fundamental. Every Algerian family was affected by the war, the cruelty, the violence, the tragedy. And the desire for vengeance existed. You can't sit back calmly when your whole family's being killed.
The 150,000 Algerian Muslims who fought for France and who are still referred to as Arquis. Ahead of independence, they were forcibly disarmed by the French army, who stood by as thousands were tortured and killed by Algerian independence fighters who regarded them as traitors. Unlike the European settlers, and despite the clear danger to their lives, Algerians who had fought for France were forbidden from immigrating to the former colonial power. But through the kindness of individual French commanders, several thousand were illegally smuggled into France. On arrival, they were confined to primitive rural camps. This is the site of such a camp in which these men used to live. It was finally demolished only in 1995. Following the war, the French state was quick to draw a line under it. An amnesty was put in place for all crimes committed during the war, and for decades it was veiled in official silence. Only in 1999, and partly under pressure from the Algerian immigrant community, did the National Assembly officially admit that a war had taken place. And this small monument was erected on the banks of the River Seine.
1st of January, 1959. A romantic revolution has been won. The 32-year-old Fidel Castro enters cheering Havana. 2 weeks after the triumph, the passenger ship Brema anchors in the port of Havana. Fidel Castro observes the docking from the former Hilton Hotel. The 19-year-old Marita Lorenz, the captain's daughter, is on board as well. She gets to know the new hero there. The young woman gives her heart to the romantic hero of the successful revolution.
I didn't care if he wore a uniform. I didn't care if he had a cigar. It was his eyes. It was everything about him. I didn't even care about politics or who he is. He kept saying, "I am Cuba."
The man who is Cuba would rather have become a baseball star. The New York Giants offered him a professional contract, but Castro refused. Power was everything to him. His anti-U.S. way of thinking was only a pretext. This wasn't the real reason. It was only used to make him more popular in public. Fulgencio Batista. Castro wants to replace this dictator who rules in America's favor. He keeps his position and protects America's interests with brutal cruelty, tortures, and murders. And the U.S. forgives him as Batista is a trustworthy servant.
We considered him to be our man, but he was beholding to us to try to keep him in power.
The Sugar Island is totally U.S. ruled. 3/4 of Cuban export goes to the U.S. Even the national drink, the cocktail Cuba Libre, has Coca-Cola as one of its ingredients.
We hated our dependence on the United States. We were fed up with suppression.
1st of December, 1956. After 6 months on a ship, Fidel Castro comes back from exile with 81 of his comrades and docks off the coast of Sierra Maestra. Batista's troops are waiting for them. Only 12 revolutionists survive, fleeing to hide in the mountains.
This was when Fidel told us to begin, with 12 people and 7 guns, and said, "Let's win the war."
Castro's small group hides in Sierra. Their activity is mostly made up of guerrilla attacks. Lots of poor farmers help the revolutionists. For a lot of Cubans, Castro soon meant the only hope for freedom. Washington ignores the revolution in Cuba. A fatal error. Castro is unpredictable. But Castro is mostly an opportunist. To communicate political principles in that situation would only set the revolution back.
If we had had evidence that he was a communist, we would have supported the Batista regime and tried to help them in any way we could to overcome his revolution.
Instead, the revolution continues. At the end of the year, St. Clara, the second biggest city of the country, falls into revolutionists' hands, a bloody victory.
We heard about the victory in St. Clara on the radio. We knew that the last hour of the despot had struck.
New Year's Eve, 1958. Batista knows that he cannot stop Castro's popular revolution. He runs away desperately from Cuba, but the U.S. cannot help him. American limousines and stolen tanks. The triumph of a winner warlord. Fidel Castro enters Havana. 2 years earlier, when they started their revolution with a dozen fighters, nobody thought this would be possible.
For the Cuban nation, it meant that the doors of prisons were open and slavery was transformed into freedom.
Castro's Cuba turns out to be just as brutal as the government he had defeated, but he had to pay a high price for his revolution. In morbid public trials, children raise charges against the followers of Batista. In the first week, they get even with every well-known representative of the old government.
He was just playing a game until he could solidify his power and then do what he did.
Castro's next step shocks the U.S. He declares himself a communist and asks for help from the only power who could help him against the U.S., Nikita Khrushchev in the Soviet Union. Castro suddenly becomes too dangerous for the United States.
I was recruited by the CIA, who had hoped that they would make me so mad and angry against Fidel that I would go back and kill him.
This was only one of the nearly dozen CIA murder attempts. The promises of the revolution were not kept, and as we can see, the revolution continues up until today. As a matter of fact, this is the longest revolution in history.
The CIA knew it as their invulnerable spy plane. The U-2 was a phantom, top secret, and a masterpiece of aviation technology. It was designed to fly over Soviet territory undetected, taking unauthorized surveillance pictures at altitudes that were unreachable to Soviet missiles and fighter planes. But on May 1st, 1960, a Soviet surface-to-air missile targeted and took a U-2 out of the sky in what was to become a renowned incident that would affect international relations and policy in the US and Soviet Union for many years to come.
I remember the commander turning to me and saying I should be ready to engage live targets. Naturally, the tension was huge. We didn't know for sure that the plane was just an intelligence aircraft. And what if it carried a nuclear bomb on board? When it came down, all of us were triumphant.
Once the plane was hit, the pilot, Francis Gary Powers, managed a dramatic bailout and was captured shortly after parachuting down on Russian soil.
At 5:36 in the morning Moscow time, an American plane crossed our border and went on with its flight deeper into the Soviet land. The government declared that the aggressor knew what he was doing as he trespassed on someone else's territory. This is why it was necessary to act and to shoot down the plane.
But Khrushchev had purposely omitted any information about the pilot. The US, assuming the pilot dead and the plane destroyed, issued a detailed statement claiming it was a weather plane that had crashed after the pilot had experienced oxygen difficulties. But it was a risky deceit.
What the Americans didn't realize was that not only was Powers still alive and being interrogated, but that many parts of the U-2 spy plane were still essentially intact, including espionage equipment and a surveillance camera from which photos were later developed. Now, the incident set US-Soviet relations back greatly and was a humiliation for the Eisenhower government, who'd been caught out lying.
Powers was eventually given a 10-year sentence for espionage, but was exchanged for a member of the KGB a few years later in a high-profile spy swap. On his return home, Powers, due in large part to the significant amount of misinformation given out from both sides during his time in captivity, was given far from a hero's welcome.
Well, when my father returned home, he was shocked to discover that there were editorials written in the press that he had defected. He had landed the plane intact. He had spilled, or they thought that he had spilled his guts and told the Soviets everything he knew. So to him, this was a little bit of a shock. And he was disappointed at the time that the American government didn't do more to help set the record straight and get rid of the misinformation.
Well, 50 years on and the incident continues to intrigue. A real-life tale of spies, lies, and what was ultimately a memorable Soviet success. Sarah Firth, RT, Moscow.